I'm Heather. After many wasted years trying outdated approaches to my daughter's addiction that felt wrong to me, harmed our relationship, and didn't help my daughter, I finally found an effective, evidence-based approach that repaired my relationship with her, helped me create my own peace of mind, and made me an ally in my daughter's recovery. I teach you a loving and compassionate approach to help you encourage change and create connection. Addiction impacts the entire family system. Family recovery is the answer. Hi, quick note before the episode starts. I'm offering a free Boundaries That Create Connection masterclass. It is going to be on Tuesday, February 20th at 7 p.m. Eastern. I am taking all of the things that I see my clients struggle with when it comes to boundaries, and I use that to make this class. It's going to be live. We're going to take some time to work on boundaries together so that you can ask questions and you don't leave the class with another thing to do and figure out on your own. So go to heatherrosscoaching.com and click on the boundaries or free masterclass link, or you can click on the boundaries masterclass link in the show notes. Okay, on with the episode. Today's guest, AliceLBaker, registered dietitian, licensed therapist, certified eating disorder specialist, has over 27 years experience in the field of eating disorders. Due to her own recovery and the freedom she found, she has been passionate about eating disorders from the beginning and has dedicated her life to coming alongside individuals on their road towards healing, increasing awareness, and reducing stigma around the topic of eating disorders. Alice has served clients with eating disorders through the full spectrum of care from inpatient to outpatient. In 2005, Alice founded Joyful Nutrition, a nutrition therapy practice committed to empowering individuals toward a peaceful relationship with food and feeling more at home in their bodies. She adheres to health at every size principles and believes strongly in a weight-inclusive practice. In 2017, Alice obtained licensure as a licensed mental health and professional counselor and founded Courageous Hearts Counseling, a trauma and social justice informed practice dedicated to coming alongside men and women as they bravely enter their stories, the wounds they have experienced, the self-protective responses they have developed to survive, and new ways to love and be loved. Her specialties include eating disorders and trauma. In 2020, Alice's son began struggling with substance use, and Alice began the treacherous journey of navigating support as a parent. This gave her a real lived experience of what it is like to witness your child in a life-threatening battle and feel powerless to change it. Through this experience, Alice learned about an evidence-based practice, Invitation to Change, and eventually obtained certification training. She now incorporates it in her work with families of those struggling with eating disorders and has seen a significant impact. Alice currently sees clients full-time, stays active on social media, and regularly presents both locally and nationally on the topic of eating disorders. As an IAEDP approved supervisor, she also provides supervision to dietitians seeking to obtain certified eating disorder specialty status and who want to grow and learn in this rewarding field. And as a mom, she continues to learn and grow and be humbled. Oh, that is the truth. Thank you so much for coming on today to talk about eating disorders.
Absolutely. My pleasure. So good to be here.
So, one, I was just really intrigued that you took the Invitation to Change and adapted it to be used with eating disorders. I think that it's such an adaptable program. And two, I really like your approach to how you even how you think about eating disorders. Just reading your bio, I was like, yes, this is why I'm doing this episode with her. So I asked in my Facebook group what people's questions were about eating disorders. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And I just want to share before we start quickly too, that Helena, my daughter, had an eating disorder, but it was like where things started with her, like depression, eating disorder, anxiety, self-harm. And then that was getting all the attention. And then eventually her substance use got all the attention. And so I never really even learned that much about eating disorders because it was just her addiction just always took front stage. And so I think that there could be a lot of other people out here dealing with that same thing. And I want to help them get information from somebody like you who has such a compassionate, science-backed background to help with.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that your daughter's story is unfortunately a common one where eating disorders start and manifest and then substance abuse comes in afterwards and sort of then as appropriately is what is focused on, right? And then a lot of times clients will come to me, they get into a place of recovery and they get into a place of substance abuse recovery and then the eating disorder is still there, right? And so they'll come to me afterwards and often they'll feel ambivalent, understandably, but many of them will say things like, this is like the last thing I have, right? I've let go of all of these other behaviors or substances, and this is the last thing I have. And then we add in our culture, diet culture, which says thinner is better, appearance is important, and all of those things. And so we're living in a culture that normalizes disordered eating. So it's the last thing they have to let go of. And then also we're living in a culture that glorifies these behaviors, which is just a double whammy.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So the first question that I got from the Facebook group is, what is the cause of an eating disorder?
Yeah. And it's so multifaceted and an individual for every person, as most struggles are. But it's a combination of things. There's a genetic component. There's a lot of research that shows that you will see it generational through families. A question I always ask when I meet with my clients is anyone in your family, could be aunt, uncle, cousin, grandma, ever struggle with an eating disorder? And I get yes a lot of the time. So there is a biological component. They've also done studies on temperament. Certain temperaments tend to be drawn to certain types of eating disorders as well. Their trauma can be a factor. None of us get a pass. So all of us have experienced painful circumstances of some kind, and how we internalize that or that's the perspective we take on that impacts, right? That will impact. But not everyone with an eating disorder has sometimes people will believe there's myths out there that people will believe that like everybody with an eating disorder has had some type of physical abuse or sexual abuse. And not everybody has. Some have, but not everybody. But that can be a factor. Culture. So it could be just even, now with social media and the impact of seeing lots of airbrushed, filtered. I mean, the filters out there, I'm still learning all the filters out there on social media that make individuals not look like themselves. And so they're getting inundated with these images of ultra thin or muscular bodies and getting the message they're supposed to look like that. Also, school culture. Some kids get bullied for their weight or their friends are dieting. And so it's cool to diet. It's cool not to eat at lunch, things like that. So lots of different, or it could even be many of my clients, what kind of kickstarted it was going to watching a movie or a documentary on how food harms our body, or we're supposed to eat in a certain health way. And then they start that, and then their temperament might be to follow the rules or to do it right. And then it kind of takes on a life of its own. So many different multifaceted reasons that an eating disorder can start and continue. Yeah.
Yeah. And I appreciate that your answer contained so many different ways, because we have a tendency to really just oversimplify everything. I think we oversimplify addiction. We oversimplify eating disorders. It's like, oh, just stop the behavior and everything will be fine. Like that's what I used to think. And
exactly.
We need to see that complexity.
Mm-hmm.
So the second question I have, well, I think that there's a couple that go together, which is, I'm just going to share all three, and you can, I can repeat the question if it gets to be too much. But so it's, how can we think about an eating disorder when our child struggles with drugs? And why should we? Isn't substance use far more dangerous? That's enough. Let's just stick with that one.
I would say take the eating disorder seriously. So you know this, that opiate addiction is the number one killer for mental health. And eating disorders are number two. So it's actually a very dangerous disorder, because it does, when you're not eating, or when you're throwing up what you're eating, or there's disordered eating, it directly physiologically impacts the body. So the impacts of malnutrition are pretty intense. And so it really, there is danger to it. It is a really dangerous disease. And so in that aspect, I say we do want to take it seriously. And the research shows that when someone gets early intervention and early treatment for eating disorders, their prognosis goes up significantly, because it hasn't had as much time to set in. So if I'm working with an adolescent who's had an eating disorder for a year and we're intervening, those neurotransmitters haven't set in as much, versus if I have someone come to me, they've had an eating disorder for 30 years and they haven't gotten treatment, that way of thinking around food is really in their neurotransmitters. It's not impossible, and people do recover. There's always hope, but it's just a lot easier when you get that early intervention.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as you were talking, I was thinking about, I totally forgot, I was just trying to get, like, I was concerned about Helena's depression, because in my mind, if I could fix the depression, that some of these other things might get better naturally. And so I was trying to get her to exercise, because she had been previously very active and cheer and all that. And then she was really laying around a lot and stuff with the depression. And the eating disorder doctor was like, you've got to stop pushing her to exercise, because her heart is in such bad shape right now from not eating that it's actually dangerous for her to exercise.
Sure. Yeah. And it's really hard, because so many things that are in and of themselves not bad things, like exercise, it would make sense that you would think that might help with your depression, get some endorphins up, things like that. When somebody is malnourished, that doctor was right, that our heart is a muscle. And so all our muscles get catabolized if we're not eating enough. And so that heart was weaker. And so if we put extra workload on that heart, it can be dangerous. But of course, you wouldn't know that, because our culture talks about exercise as a good thing. And in many instances, it is. And so with eating disorders, it is important and I'm glad you had that doctor to be able to tell you that. Because there are some doctors who do not specialize in eating disorders who might not know that and just say, yeah, that's a great idea, and then put her at risk. So, because there are some differences, we often will put exercise on hold temporarily until someone can get renourished and rehabilitated, for sure.
So how can we support somebody who is struggling with an eating disorder and substance use disorder? And how common is it for somebody to have both?
So unfortunately, it is common. It's very, very common. And sometimes the eating disorder can promote drug use. So if someone's wanting to lose weight and they will take a stimulant, they're going to, it actually literally speeds up the metabolism, and they're usually not going to eat for days, and they get really thin, and that feels good to them. So they get the high, but they also get the high from being thin. Or maybe they've tried to lose weight via dieting and they can't. So then they get introduced to some type of stimulant, cocaine or something like that, that helps them lose weight. And it starts that way. So sometimes it can even be connected with that. So there's lots of ways you can support somebody with an eating disorder and substance abuse. And I know it can just feel so overwhelming because you've got treatment after treatment after treatment. I would say there are therapists out there who work with both substance abuse disorder and eating disorders. And it would be good to find somebody who has a knowledge of eating disorders and has that specialty so that they could also address those same things. Also, having a doctor on board, a really good doctor on board to just monitor that, and a dietitian if possible. And again, I always put a disclaimer out there that I am aware that all of this costs money, and it's hard to, I can imagine someone sitting at home right now thinking like, okay, I'm already paying this much per week and now I have to get a dietitian, right? It can just feel so overwhelming. So you know your situation, you know what you could do, but at least having one person on board that specializes in eating disorders that can address some of those issues that might get missed with someone who doesn't specialize. And then one of the most important things, and I know you, Heather, talk about this in just the substance abuse arena, is doing your own work. So this is where that invitation to change comes in so beautifully, of, the part of self-awareness and self-compassion and those tools and techniques, and looking at what is my relationship with food? What am I saying about my own body? What am I saying about someone else's body? What am I saying about food? And really beginning to get curious about that and start to challenge diet culture and start to challenge that sentiment that some bodies are better than others or thinner is better. And maybe dive in to some intuitive eating yourself, and because as you begin to shift and change and look at that, that has impact on your kid. It's probably one of the biggest impacts, especially in the area of food and weight, because our culture is so diet focused, that if our kids can see in the home that it can be done differently and look different, that has impact.
Yeah. That self-awareness is so important, especially when you're under the stress of, like, I felt like I was playing that game whack-a-mole. Like, I would address the anxiety and the eating disorder would crop up. I would address the eating disorder. And then it was just like so overwhelming. So you're right, that work that we do on ourselves, like, I can never stress enough how important that is. And it seems like that we shouldn't have to do this work for somebody else's problem, but it affects us. It is affecting our whole family, and we have control over our experience with that. So I just want to back up what you said there, because I can't say stress the importance of that enough for the whole family.
Yeah.
So how common is an eating disorder in boys and men?
So there's statistics, and then I'll give you my 2 cents too afterwards. But statistics, some of the latest research shows that about 25% of those that struggle with anorexia nervosa are men, and about 30% of bulimia nervosa of men. And ARFID, which is newer in the DSM, which is avoidant food restrictive intake disorder, is that actually has a higher percentage of males. About 67% of those that struggle with ARFID are males. ARFID is characterized as it's got three components to it: a real sensitivity to tastes and textures. So often these kids usually just will only eat like about 2 or 3 foods or 5 or 10 foods, and that's it. A loss of interest in eating. Food just gets in the way. They just really don't like eating. Or they've got a fear that something bad's going to happen. If I eat this, I might get sick or I might choke. And so they don't eat. And so their restriction is the same level to cause malnutrition, but it's from a different perspective versus the way I want to look or trying to reduce calories or things like that. And so there's a higher percentage of males there. Often with males too, it looks different. Even anorexia nervosa or bulimia nervosa looks different. So it might be more for women. It might be more like just thinner, leaner. For men, it might be more muscular. I want to look more muscular, or even like I want to build muscle and it's never enough. Also, in a lot of our culture, it's looked at as kind of cool to eat a lot. So that's why you'll see the bulimia, I'll eat a lot and get rid of it, or binge eating disorder also as well in men, because it's cool to sort of eat a whole pizza, right? Like that's awesome. And so it does manifest a little bit differently. Like where women were stereotypical, the culture is like we're supposed to be dainty and not eat with gusto, and right, like that kind of thing. None of this is right. None of this is okay, but this just tends to be the stereotypical messages that culture will send as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just like men, it's cool to eat more, and women, it's cool to eat less. Like,
yes,
so
I know. Yes.
So what treatment approach has been proven to be most effective with eating disorders?
Well, I kind of say this tongue in cheek. It depends on which professional you talk to, because everyone kind of has their bias. The good news in that, though, is that there are so many really good treatments out there. But a few that I will highlight. One is called family-based therapy. It's FBT. It's known as FBT. That's for youth mostly, though it can sometimes be done with young adults. It depends on the family situation. But it was developed in Europe, and it's basically where parents take on the responsibility for plating the meals for the kids, and they sit with them and they support them. And the parents work with a professional, an FBT certified professional that will help them and empower them as they feed. And the expectation is, or the assumption is that parents know how to cook meals. They know how to make food. And so they begin to make a plate of food with multiple food groups, and they begin to create a supportive environment at mealtimes, and they refeed their children. It's actually been shown to be pretty impactful. There is a whole, and I can give you this if you want to put it in the show notes, but there's a whole environment out there called Feast, FEAST, which it's very empowering for parents. It gives, recipes, it gives different tools and techniques and things like that for parents to, I think there's some free virtual groups there as well. So it's a great supportive environment as well. It actually aligns with Invitation to Change really well. There's a level of, there are things we can do that impact our kids. There's a level, it also talks about how behaviors make sense, right? And how there's always a reason for the madness. And so it aligns really well with that as well. And, caring for ourselves and self-care as well. And communication strategies. A lot of the communication strategies overlap and are similar. Mm-hmm. So it can be combined with that. Another one is CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And there's different versions. There's one called enhanced CBT. And basically what we're doing when we work with a client is we're learning, how does the eating disorder function for you? Right? So what is it doing for you? There is a reason for the madness. All behaviors have a story to tell us. They all have a story to tell us. And so how is it functioning for you? How is it being maintained? What are the systems or structures or people or places or things? How is it being maintained? And then how can we disrupt that cycle? What can we do to start to disrupt that cycle? And that is great. And now I could keep going. There's acceptance commitment therapy. There's dialectical behavioral therapy has shown a lot of research. Somatic therapy, especially for people who've experienced trauma, somatic therapy and EMDR. So many of these, there's so many, which is really helpful. Narrative therapy, externalizing the eating disorder. Sometimes people refer to their eating disorders as ED. There's actually a book out there called Life Without ED, which Jenny Schaefer talks about her recovery. And it's a great way to kind of get some separation, that there's this sort of mean voice in my head telling me not to eat and I'm overweight and I don't have to listen to that voice. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Like I call the mean voice in my head, Judge Judy.
Yes. Yeah. There you go. Yeah.
Exactly. Some perspective.
Exactly. Yeah.
So this question wasn't asked, but it made me think, is there anything that's like, so, when somebody's looking for a therapist to help with addiction, we don't want somebody who's going to put them, maybe take a stigmatized approach or
right.
Like, what are some things to look, maybe that might be a red flag that person might be working with an outdated view of things?
Mm-hmm. The first thing that comes to my mind is if you get the feeling that they're going to tell you what to do and that they're the expert, and so you need to listen to them. And if you don't do it their way, then your child is just doomed, right? That regardless of what theory they provide therapy from or what tool or skills approach they use, any really good professional is going to be one that's going to listen to your story and give you some feedback that feels really individualized, that feels like they're really listening to your specific situation. They might give you some standard things, because there are some standard things we know that are really helpful, but you get the feeling that they're really leaning in and hearing your situation and that they can think outside of the box. One of the things that I love about having been able to do outpatient therapy for as long as I've been able to is I've gotten to see so many different recovery stories. And so often it doesn't go the way that us professionals, I include myself in that because I've bombed in that area before, that it doesn't go the way we think it's going to go. We think, oh, you've got to follow these rules. And very often individuals, they will take a very individual path. So someone who can really understand that and is willing to walk with you on that path, even if it's outside of the box, that would probably be the biggest thing I would say, to where you're not going to get that sort of stigmatized approach. Someone who's not, where you don't get the idea that they're kind of like a black and white thinker, like it's got to be this way or it's not going to work kind of thing.
Yeah, I think those are great things to look for when you're looking for any kind of therapy. Those are great ideas. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
The next question I have is, how do you create change when somebody has a malnourished brain?
Okay. I want to go back really quick. One other thing to add to that, to decrease stigma, is that this professional would be aligned with or have good knowledge about health at every size principles too. And that is principles that we come in all different shapes and sizes. We live in a culture that kind of has a hierarchy of bodies, says some bodies are better than others. And someone that really understands the impact of that culture and that can see that as long as we're caring for ourselves well and we're maintaining really good, kind body practices, wherever our body ends up is where it's supposed to be. That's important too, because that can create a stigma that can keep someone stuck in an eating disorder. So I just wanted to name that because I had forgotten to name that.
Yeah. That sounds like meeting people where they're at.
Yeah, exactly.
That's great.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you repeat that question again?
Yeah. How do you create change when somebody has a malnourished brain?
Sure. Mm-hmm. So it's difficult to answer. It's definitely difficult to practice because when somebody has a malnourished brain, just the nature of malnutrition, the way it impacts the brain, we become more rigid in our thinking. We become more inflexible in our thinking. We become more anxious in our thinking. We become more perfectionistic. We also our emotions become more difficult to regulate. We can go from 0 to 60 really fast. And so if you've got someone who is significantly malnourished every day of the week, it is really difficult to get much therapeutic movement without renourishing. The best thing you can do is empathy, coming alongside them, letting them know you hear them, validating them, a lot of that. And then setting the boundary of, and this is the hard part, setting the boundary of them getting renourishment, nutrition rehabilitation, whether that is either through a dietitian or family-based therapy or some other area. And then as they start to get more nourished, the rigid thinking begins to go down, the inflexibility begins to go down, the anxiety begins to go down just on a physiological level because they're getting nourished. The treacherous part, though, is the eating disorders in there, right? So the fear of weight gain, or if they do begin to gain weight, how uncomfortable that is for them. When somebody's refeeding, sometimes they'll feel more bloated. Sometimes their stomachs will feel overfull because part of the impact of malnutrition is their digestive system isn't working as well. And so normal amounts of food feel like huge amounts of food to them, not just psychologically, but physiologically too. And they get full faster and stay full longer. And so there's just all these sort of hurdles in there that make it really hard to rehabilitate nutritionally. But it's the necessary thing that's going to help get them out of this. So it's a treacherous road. It's definitely a treacherous road. And we just let it all coexist at the same time. I also say just don't take anything personally. Don't take anything personally that they're saying. It's not uncommon for someone to feel the very thing that's been helping them feel good, the solution to their problem, is being taken away very directly. And so they're threatened, and so they're going to lash out. It's not uncommon for parents to say to me, like, my kid never said anything like this to me, and now they're saying these things to me, and they're scared. They're scared of gaining weight. They're scared of what that's going to mean. They're scared of losing this thing that's helped them feel so good. Yeah.
I'm having all these memories flooding back as we're talking and just thinking about how, like, not taking it personally, how I took everything personally for so long, like that. And that just complicated things. And it just made me so hurt all the time, made everything she was doing about me. And it really did. It was another roadblock. But I didn't have that self-awareness yet. I thought that I was entitled to that feeling and that I didn't realize it was just making everything worse. But you mentioned them lashing out and acting differently, the rigid thinking, the inflexibility, the anxiety, all those things I was thinking were happening at that time too. And I think it's similar with when you're dealing with addiction as well, and they're not taking care of themselves. So even if it's not malnourished from food, there is some malnourishment going on with their brain. And when they're not getting enough sleep, they're maybe not drinking water. They might not be eating very out. Like all these, they're getting completely depleted. Totally makes sense. I love that explanation for why, going back to behaviors make sense,
Right.
why
Right.
these behaviors make sense.
Right. Right. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. It's uncanny how malnutrition and dehydration can impact mood, behavior, communication, all of the above on so many levels in so many ways.
Yeah. Now I want to ask you this one first because we're on time. I want to make sure we get this one.
Mhm.
How do you work with a family member when their child isn't ready for help yet?
Sure. That's a really good question. I will work with the family members, without the kids. And we will typically, a lot of times, we'll do a type of family based therapy where they might start plating the meals for their kids, and we'll work with that. And we incrementally will increase their intake. We'll start where the client is or that I should say their child is, and we incrementally increase. And the parents are doing all of that. They're plating the meals, they're providing the meals. And then I also work with them on the language to use with clients. Like, there are no good or bad foods. There are all foods fit. If they're watching a movie or a TV show or an award show, challenging the culture. Like, isn't that interesting that we're seeing so many of the main characters in these movies are thin? Why is that? What kind of representation is that giving? I'll work with families on their own relationships with their own bodies. If they're feeling uncomfortable in their bodies, beginning to get curious about that. And what are the words they're using towards their body, and changing that language that they're saying in front of the kids. We'll do a lot of invitation to change work as well. We'll look at how behaviors make sense. We'll look at that self-awareness and understanding. We'll look at positive communication strategies and things like that. I actually really enjoy doing that because it's just so fun to watch as parents begin to make changes, just how the kids respond. At first, they're kind of like, who is this? Who stole my parents? What happened? Right. And then they just start to settle in. Kids often, when they see their parents make a change in their own relationship with food, maybe the parent kind of been like the rest of us, because diet culture is the water that we swim in, had been on and off in diets, right? And they stop and they start eating, and they start talking about how all food fits and how they're enjoying this food and how food tastes and how hungry they are and how full they are afterwards, and just how good it feels to be nourished and that kind of thing. They take notice, and it begins to give them another picture of what a relationship with food can look like. And so that can have good impact. Also, we talk about boundary setting, because when somebody is not eating, if that is their eating disorder they struggle with, is a restrictive eating disorder, that sometimes sort of life stops until you start eating, right? So you're not going to be able to do that sport, or you're not going to be able to, you don't have the energy to go walk the mall with your friends because you haven't eaten, right? Different boundaries that we set, and we'll work on, how do we set that boundary? What does that look like? What are the consequences if that doesn't follow through, right? And as you know, this part of invitation to change is boundaries are for us, right? So it's the value system that we hold. So if my value system is that, I'm going to keep those under my roof safe, and then, like, under my roof, you have to nourish your body to be able to go out to do those things. So we talk through that as well. So depending on the situation, if the child is older, if I'm working with a family member and the child is an adult and they're older, it'll look really different, right? They're not going to be plating their foods. There's going to be a lot more. I might do more work with the family member about their own relationship with food and body image and communication strategies with their child and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, those are all great. It really shows how much work we can do to set the stage for our kids to want to make changes or to just even respond well to our changes. Like we
Right.
really do. We're often told we're just powerless in these situations, and we really aren't. So I appreciate that your answer
Yeah.
shows that there are things that we can do, even if the person is struggling with, they're not ready to change yet. We can start making
Exactly.
changes that make things better for us and set a better
Mhm.
example for them.
Right.
So I think that we'll stop with that question because I don't want
Okay.
to rush. So is
Sure.
there anything that you really needed to say that we didn't get to share today?
I feel like we've covered a lot, actually.
Yeah,
I feel like we've covered a lot. Yeah,
I think that's a lot to
absolutely.
take in.
I think the thing I would just emphasize, and I know this is a theme throughout your podcast and just in general for whether it's substance abuse or eating disorders, is really taking care of yourself is loving your kids well. When you take care of yourself and when you give yourself space, you're loving your kids well and they will take notice of that. So when you nourish yourself, sometimes it's easy as parents to be like, I want to make sure my kids get fed and, but I'll eat later. Right. But when you nourish yourself and you show that model, that's loving your kids well. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So I just want to share that Alice is a therapist that she can work with anybody in Arizona or Florida. And as a dietitian, she can work with anybody in Arizona, Florida, Colorado, Virginia, and Michigan. And I'm going to put that in the show notes as well. So if you're interested in working with her, you'll be able to get that information from the show notes. And I just want to thank you so much for your time today to share this information. I've been wanting to do an episode about an eating disorder for a long time, and I've been waiting for the right person. So I'm so glad that you came along, that we could answer these questions for everybody.
Absolutely. It's such a pleasure. Such a pleasure. Really enjoyed talking with you as well and just talking about this topic.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you want to learn more about my work, go to heatherrosscoaching.com. If you want to help other parents who are struggling with a child's addiction, you can do it two different ways. First, you can share the podcast with them directly, or you can share it on your social media. Second, you can leave a review. Talk to you next week.